We're going to get started as soon as our panelists are mic'd up.
Nah, I'm doing caffeine.
We all set? All right, everyone, we'll get started. You know, when I put together the forum a year out, generally speaking, I spend as much time thinking about who the best moderator would be for a particular panel as I do who the best participants should be and, of course, what the topic is. And when I thought of the panel for industry and innovation, I thought the ideal moderator would be the one we, in fact, have, Noah Shachtman, who is a contributing editor at Wired magazine, and he may be best known as the editor of a national security blog that I certainly read, and I'm sure all of us in the room read, called Danger Room. Noah has written for a number of publications other than Wired, as you see here, the New York Times Magazine, the Journal, and Foreign Policy. And I think it's also noteworthy, as it says here, that he not only learns from DoD and the intelligence community and other parts of the national security architecture as a journalist, but he also teaches DoD in the intelligence community. He's frequently called upon by DoD and the intelligence community in particular to contribute to policy debates. So with that, Noah Shachtman.
Thanks. I promise this will be the awesomest panel ever. So I want to start out this awesomest panel ever by, first by thanking Clark and everybody at the Aspen Institute. This has been really amazing. Both the scenery and the discussions have been fantastic. And I wanted to start off the panel with a little story from yesterday. The Army decided yesterday that they're once again going to put on hold their plan to give digital radios to soldiers and to let soldiers track one another on digital maps with handheld computers. This plan has been in the works since, get ready for this, since 1991. They have spent $1 billion on this effort. And when I saw an early generation in Iraq in 2007, this contraption weighed 10 pounds and sat on top of a soldier's helmet. Meanwhile, the Spec Ops guys had something with very similar capabilities that they carried around their hands. It's called a BlackBerry. And now the Army's decided that maybe they'll go for iPhones instead of the billion-dollar solution. A couple years later, I was at a air base in Southwest Asia where they guide the air wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the targeteers, the guys that decided which targets were acceptable and which ones aren't, and where it's okay to drop a bomb and where not, had all this sophisticated tools. Government created billions of dollars worth, but they didn't use any of that stuff. Instead, they were just using Google Earth. So it's an example of what you guys probably already know today, which is that really private companies drive innovation today, and government does its best to kind of leverage what it finds in the private sector. But believe it or not, I know this is going to come as a great shock to everybody in this room. the relationship between government and industry is not perfect all the time, amazingly. It's hard to believe that joke really flopped, huh? So at the same time, businesses have become targets as well as suppliers to the security world. They've become targets. We've seen that recently in cyber attacks on Lockheed and L3. My own employer, Condé Nast, recently got scammed out of $8 million with a single email. We're rather proud of that at Condé. And so these corporate vulnerabilities are especially worrisome because when you start talking about the power grid, it's all fine if Condé Nast gets hacked, but when we're talking about the power grid or the companies that hold most of our defense know-how, that gets to be a real sort of strategic concern. So here, that's a lot of stuff to get through in an hour, and luckily we've got an all-star panel to do all that. Starting left to right, we've got Tom Herring, who's a senior vice president at AeroVironment. They're the guys that make the handheld Raven drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, which are sort of one of the most important technologies to come out of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. To his left is Jack Lichtenstein. He's a senior vice president at ASIS International, which represents more than 37,000 security professionals. Next to him is Marc, who is the president and CEO of the Homeland Security and Defense Business Council. They are a collection of the top contractors and solution providers. That's the word you like, right? To the Pentagon and DHS. Next to him is Marc Nathanson. He has more jobs and more titles than you would believe, including he's the former chairman of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and he's the founder of the Homeland Security Advisory Council of Los Angeles, which is a collection of 75 CEOs in the LA area that have worked hard to make some improvements to the security in the neighborhood. And then finally, we have, in this smashing jacket, we have Chris Taylor, the CEO of Mission Essential Personnel, which supplies to the military 8,300 translators and intel analysts. Would you say that's...
And trainers.
And trainers in 16 countries around the world.
In 16 countries.
Okay, right. There you go. So...
I'm sorry, this is a smooth jacket. I'm just saying.
It is, totally. Are you kidding? I'm always serious all the time. I'm going to start with Tom because, like everybody at Wired, I'm totally drone obsessed. So I'm going to start with you. Tom, you guys were working on UAVs for 15 years, right? Before the government really took a significant interest.
Yeah, it took us 15 years to be an overnight success. We actually started building small unmanned air systems back in the early, mid-1980s. We were not defense focused. We were actually thinking of applications where Homeland Security, even at that time, for first responders was the application initially. But we obviously shifted our attention. And the question became for us, how do we sell? How do we take this innovative idea and bring it to the warfighter? How do you get the attention of the U.S. government and actually find a person who's interested in this? I won't go through the whole long, drawn-out story that was there, but I will say this, that many of the things that you've been hearing today, starting with the discussions with Admiral Olson on Wednesday evening, said take things to those people who have critical needs first. SOCOM fits that bill so well. I use an analogy oftentimes at work to try to avoid the light switch and let's use the dimmer switch. Let's get people who have a need and satisfy that need first. As we're going to learn from how they apply that technology or that innovation. We will learn, we'll get feedback from that, and those successes, we'll build on those successes and take it out to the larger scale, to the warfighter. If we had tried to bring our capability to the U.S. Army initially and said this is something that should be deployed uniformly across your forces, I think we'd still be where we were in 1982.
So the idea is sort of take things in small numbers to early adopters first.
I think the biggest issue is find the early adopter with a huge need. Pushing things upon the Department of Defense or our government is never a good idea. Find the opportunity for someone to find something that pulls you through. If you can do that, you'll be successful in this business.
And so how many of these things are now deployed?
We've sold over 18,000 of our small unmanned air systems to date. And they range from little things that you may have seen that fly like a bird, flapping wings at a size and actually look like a hummingbird, to air vehicles that fly, they're about 13 pounds, that can fly for a couple hours at a time.
So mostly small handheld drones. So
Mostly small handheld drones, yes.
And so those have worked great in Iraq and Afghanistan. So naturally, you've been able to sell a boatload of these things to DHS, right?
Yeah. So to date, we're getting back to the same issue, and Noah's very good at setting me up. To date, we haven't been able to bring this to the DHS, though we would argue that the applications, the missions that are there might be very similar, and it should be a natural product that could be adopted. There are obstacles related to national airspace, as well as obstacles related to, I think, DHS defining its mission objectives and then putting TTPs, techniques, tactics, and procedures behind it that would embody these same capabilities that are being enjoyed and used by our armed personnel overseas.
So say that again. So you want to sell it to, you want to sell these things domestically, but
there are obstacles, and I think the two major obstacles, I believe, are national airspace potential is always being used as an excuse, and the second is familiarity with the system and trying to connect with the right people who can see its utility and adopt it.
Okay, so this is all about...
I'll say it this way, Noah. In the military, someone can come back with a story and say, this is how I apply this capability and this is how it saved a person's life. That resonates with another person. Maybe they're wearing a different color uniform, but it resonates with that individual and says, I see how that can be done. DHS, they're not necessarily saving lives. This is maybe used more, it can, but it will also be used as a cost-effective tool. I don't think the soldier, the reason this has been adopted so readily in the U.S., they're not looking for a cost-effective tool. They're looking for something that's going to save their life and save the lives of the person next to it. And maybe that's another reason why we haven't had that adoption in DHS.
Yeah, can I, and I think what this illustrates is an inherent problem in trying to bring innovations to the U.S. government. And it's on both sides. One is the U.S. government is, to buy things, is set up to buy products, not services, generally speaking. But two is we have to go find those people who are adopting. Yeah. The way requirements are collected within any agency, whether it be in DOD or the civilian agencies, by the time that makes it to some sort of request for proposal, have been twisted and changed and gotten to something that meets the competition requirements of the federal acquisition regulations and may no longer necessarily look like what the original need was from the person whomever that may be.
So the problem is that you've got to go through all this bureaucratic rigmarole before you can even get somebody to sign a piece of paper that says, yes, we'd like to buy
It's
something.
half the problem. The other half of the problem is us. And one of the things as we do is we continue to play that game. It really is necessary for the private sector to reimagine its partnership with government given these 21st century intractable problems that we have. Contracting, generally speaking, is a used car deal, right? The government is trying to get what it wants for the least amount of price, and I'm trying to sell you something for the most amount of profit. Of course, it's more complex than that, but that's what we're trying to do. It has to be way more nuanced to meet some of these challenges that we face today. We have to absolutely reimagine the partnership. And, by the way, I'll give you an example. The QDR, the 2010 National Security Strategy, the
QDR is the
Quadrennial Defense Review, yeah. The State Department's QDDR, Diplomacy Review, the National Security Strategy make almost no mention of the private sector or quote-unquote contractors. Yet, there's many contractors or private sector people supporting many of these operations as there are people either in one uniform or another. It seems to me we should be spending more time talking about how we push this partnership closer together and grow it rather than keeping it at arm's length distance to sort of preserve some federal acquisition regulation or competition. It's going to get in the way of us finding an optimal solution to some of these very difficult problems that we have. Okay,
so what does that mean? I mean, that sounds kind of cool and interesting, but hey, as a taxpayer, I want to make sure that there's not no bid contracts and that kind of stuff.
Sure. Actually, I would say that within the federal acquisition regulations, there is contracting officers or source selections can be made for compelling needs on a sole source basis. I get the point, though, overall. What the real challenge then is we've moved to this, let's find a... Chris Taylor wants to bring one of the coolest drones he can somewhere. I get an adopter, they say, we're going to contract it. But regulations within the government drive us to commoditize that. So no credit is actually given necessarily for Tom's invention. We will find its way into an RFP, request for proposal. We put it out for bid, so every Tom, Dick, and Harry can possibly bid on it. It gets commoditized, and then we issue it under a lowest price, technically acceptable contract in some cases. And if it's a difficult problem, can you really have 6 winners who have a lowest price, technically acceptable solution to a very difficult challenge? I don't think you can.
I think that I can't speak to any particular technology or product or service or anything like that, because I think that we're starting into the middle of the game when we talk about the RFP process. I think we're talking in the middle of the game when we don't have a long-term strategy or a blueprint that's put together, and therefore any company that is trying to sell its technology, its service, its product in a vacuum and trying to go up to DHS or any agency and saying, I've got the latest, greatest, widget in the world, we have to have an open and frank and transparent dialogue long before the RFP has even begun to be formulated. I'm not going to go to where Chris is going in terms of a public-private partnership, because I think that that's an overused phrase. It's like waste, fraud, and abuse. But we need greater collaboration, communication, and cooperation between industry and government. No matter what comes out of this cluster that's going on in Washington this week, one of the things that we're going to have to realize is that the money is going to be different. We are in a new normal. And in that new normal, we're going to have to approach, at least from the DHS standpoint, we're going to have to approach these issues in a smarter way. We're going to have to do it more effectively and more efficiently. And I think that part of that is this open dialogue between industry and government long before Tom's or Chris's product is there. Our council met with Secretary Chertoff after he left office, and one of the things that he said to our board, which was very, very important, was that company after company after company, when he was in the role, came to him and to the department with the latest technology, the latest service, the latest product, but didn't speak to the issue of solutions, as you talked about. Didn't speak to the overall mission. Part of that is because the mission hasn't been necessarily defined. We in industry don't know what the needs are. You can't just respond to, in the HS field, a QHSR. That's just the cacophony of people saying this is what should be. We don't have that long-term strategy.
What's a QHSR? What's a
QHSR is the Quadrennial Homeland Security Review in terms of what Chris was talking about in the defense. Everybody has one. The reason that DOD doesn't rely just on the QDR is because it has a long-term strategy. DHS doesn't have that. The Congress hasn't issued a reauthorization of the whole department. We don't have that long-term strategy, and therefore industry doesn't have the knowledge it needs to produce the product, the service, the technology, the solution to mission. And we've got to get off of the individual issues and go to the broader concept of how do we provide the solutions that meet the need of mission.
Without that long-term roadmap, it's impossible to do.
Exactly.
We can provide a solution that will have a long-term cost benefit, but in the near term will always be viewed as an additive cost.
So what you guys are saying is there's nowhere that it says, okay, here is mission 1 of DHS, here's mission 2, 3, 4, chem bio, things that blow up, cyber, whatever. There's no organizing strategy.
There may be, but it's not necessary. But it always comes out, as Chris was talking about, in the RFP. And we're talking about having this discussion long before the RFP is issued. We're talking about not treating industry as a pariah, not always focusing on the need for insourcing. The government has all the answers, or what is inherently governmental. We need to go take a step back in this new normal and begin to look at and open up a transparent dialogue between industry and government, not as adversaries, but as cooperative folks who want to collaborate on what that mission is.
Yeah.
A lot of people are under the perception that the new ethics rules in the Obama administration actually prevent that from happening.
Yes.
Is that something that you guys have seen, that there's less dialogue than there used to be? And do those rules actually prevent you talking about, hey, I've got a great radiation detector, or hey, I've got a great new drone, or I've got a great new explosive detector?
Noah, before I address that, let me take a step back, if I might.
Sure.
We've gotten into the weeds pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's mainly been a discussion so far of relationships between government agencies and their service and product providers. I'd just like to step back and look at businesses' relationship with government in the security space, starting in a very general sense. The program description for this particular session asks what role does and should industry play in defending critical infrastructure. That's pretty broad, and my answer would be most. 85% of the critical infrastructures in this country are owned or operated by the private sector. And therefore, the primary responsibility for defending those critical infrastructures rests with the private sector, augmented, of course, with their federal, state, and local partners in law enforcement and security. I looked at the program for this event. This is my second year here. It's a great event. I saw a lot of companies listed as being in attendance. But most of the companies that are attending this event this year are companies that provide products and services to the federal government in the defense or security space. There is a vast world of corporations out there who protect our critical infrastructures, and I don't see them represented here. It's not the Aspen Institute's fault. I think we need to work hard, and I've told Clark Kent Urban that I want to continue to work with him to bring added corporate participation in this, particularly our ASIS International members who are corporate chief security officers and who are responsible for protecting all these great American companies. They not only protect 85% of the critical infrastructures, but they protect the places where Americans spend a third or more of every day. They protect the places where we all work. And then they protect the places where we go outside work, commercially, transportation, recreation. A lot of the places where Americans spend a great deal of their time are protected primarily by private security professionals, many who come from law enforcement and military backgrounds. And therefore, they know government, they understand government, they know how it works, and yet they have this responsibility and this added security duty, which varies from company to company and industry sector to industry sector. I'll stop that and get back to the question that was raised about, and I will call public-private partnership what I always have, which is public-private partnership, or P3, because it's the only way that we've come up with so far of describing this unique relationship between private security and government. It is a concept that used to be more noted for its absence than for its presence. When I think back to 9/11 and the days before 9/11, public and private sector barely talked with each other, shared virtually no information, except sometimes at a local level where the police chief was a friend of the security director of the corporation and they would talk all the time. In 8 or 9 years, I have seen the relationship develop and improve tremendously. Nonetheless, there are still times when government seems incapable of understanding all the dimensions and the potential embodied in partnership. And I'll give you a quick example, which is a small one, and I mentioned it to Noah and my fellow panelists yesterday. We decided, ASIS decided, that it would be great if our chapter chairs all around the country, we have 150 chapters in the U.S., if we sent each of our chapter chairs the contact information for the intelligence officer from DHS and the protective security advisor from DHS in their area. Name and contact information. We told our chapter chairs, if you haven't talked with these people already, contact them, bring them in, have them as a speaker at a luncheon, have them as a panelist, work on developing joint exercises and programs. So I&A and intelligence and analysis and infrastructure protection at DHS said, this is a great idea, we'll give you the contact information. And then they checked with the lawyers. Now, it made sense to us to send the name of the protective security advisor for an area to one person with contact information. That was our chapter chair. The lawyers immediately recoiled and said their legal objection, at first at least, was based on privacy considerations. My friend Bill Flynn in Infrastructure Protection, who oversees the PSA, said, wait a minute, privacy considerations? This is public information. These are the names and this is the contact information of government officials that the private sector needs to know and work with. The lawyers then dropped the privacy objection and said that they just didn't feel comfortable with it. They didn't think it was a good idea, which as far as I know, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think that's a legal argument. In any case, after a couple of weeks of intense pressure and prodding, they relented, and now we're doing something that's on its face is a great idea to enhance public-private partnership at the operating level, at the tip of the spear, where these relationships are most important, but we still had to encounter and overcome objections from the legal shop. So, long way of answering your question, Noah.
Marc, Nathanson, I wanted to bring you in because your group works with government at a very different level, at the CEO level. And you guys have done some interesting things in LA, having CEOs kind of work in cooperation with the government.
Well, in Los Angeles, after 9/11, the Sheriff Lee Baca, the police chief, Bill Bratton, the mayor, now Antonio Villaraigosa, all decided we better come together. We can't rely on the federal government for some of the reasons that are being addressed here. To get anything done in our own backyard, which is LA and Orange County, FEMA Region 1 in California, 12 million people, we have to take care of ourselves working with the first responders and business. And it is a public-private partnership for that point of view. We went to the CEO level because we wanted to get things done quickly. And what we did, purely on a volunteer basis, is have all the major businesses in Los Angeles subscribe to a database that they would put their resources, and as you said, 85% of the resources that the first responders need in time of crisis, which could be a terrorist attack, it could be an earthquake, it could be a forest fire in the case of Los Angeles area, on a database that would be available only to first responders on a 24-hour basis, where they could bring in whatever equipment they needed. And we got legislation changed in the California legislature to protect the companies that would contribute this type of equipment that the first responders...
What kind of equipment are we talking about?
We're talking about Paramount Pictures giving 150 light units with generators that could be brought in if power was down. No first responder, fire, police, emergency services has that type of equipment. We're talking about everything from helicopters. We're talking about transportation centers. We're even talking about the cooperation in our organization with the unions who supply specialists that may be needed in times of crisis. This is all available at no charge to the first responders. Our attitude is, I can't say that word, our attitude is don't rely on DHS. Don't rely, let's just do it in our own backyard. Let's take care of ourselves. Let's unify all the businesses that are involved in anything related to crisis management and bring them together. And we have done that, and we've gotten total cooperation from both the city and county, which isn't easy to do in our neck of the woods. And we have this database up and running and available to first responders to use.
Makes eminent sense to me.
No, it makes eminent sense, and I'll tell you what the but is. Not every city and not every community and not every county can necessarily afford what LA can do. And therefore, we cannot extrapolate, and certainly none of my members can extrapolate that when you get a good contract, when you get a contract in LA, all it means is you got a contract in LA. There is no economies of scale. And what we have been asking for 10 years, and in terms of the relationship with DHS, is guidance. I'm not saying that DHS necessarily has to and should not pick a winner, should not pick the best of breed, but can provide the guidance to communities in a much better way than just handing out grant money. There has to be some substantive guidance as part of a relationship so that in point of fact, you don't know necessarily whether the chief of police of community X is listening to his brother-in-law and what the best product is, or listening to a broader component part of what might be the best for the mission of what Sioux City needs versus New York City. And so the context is that what I was talking about in terms of the blueprint is that in essence we need guidance to the state and locals so that in essence if LA did it the right way, how does that get communicated to San Francisco, to New York, to Boston, to anywhere else? We need the DHS model to be that kind of facilitator of communication so that best of breeds or ways of mission can in essence be extrapolated beyond.
And I don't disagree with that. And I have met with DHS, and even before DHS was formed, but they just do not put a lot of emphasis on the local business community or even local law enforcement. After 9/11, they went to local law enforcement in LA County and said, these are student visas, we want to know where these students are, here's 5,000 of them. Well, the sheriffs went to them and said, wait a second, 5,000 student visas. Tell us the 500 which are your highest priority so we can put manpower. They said, oh, we can't tell you that because you don't have security clearance, Mr. Sheriff or Mr. Police Chief. So it's not always so easy to work with DHS on the private sector. We took the model, we'll do it ourselves, we'll tell DHS about it, we'll work with their liaisons who work with the private sector, we work with all the security people in Los Angeles who are related to corporations, and we have a very good cooperative attitude. It can be done in any city in the United States of size. It takes some money. We raise the money ourselves from the local business community.
Chris, and then I think we're going to take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to see the conversations from an innovation perspective. It's easy to see where perhaps born from frustration, local communities and organizations that would represent them opt to create their own solutions because that's what they think is the best for that particular set of communities, whereas other people, their innovations, they try to push into the federal response system, if you will, the acquisition process. And you can see just from these discussions that there's opposing views on how to get a finite amount of dollars to be put toward a particularly innovative idea that may be a good idea for lots of folks, but not everyone. So it's just an interesting how this has sort of evolved all the way across.
Right. One is do it yourself, and one is try to get some guidance out of the government.
It's not one size fits all.
Yeah. So we're going to take some questions from the audience. Let's actually have them be questions, like a question mark at the end, no speeches, pontifications, lectures, harangues, and wait for the microphone to be passed around. I think we got a question over here in the back.
I'm Mike Kelly from Task. What I've heard described is these gentlemen talk about what the elephant feels like from their vantage point. And so what I'd like to ask each of them, or if at least one or two of them would respond with, while it isn't one size fits all, we have to come up with a mechanism that looks at the process across the board and recognizes that there are state and local interests, there are federal interests, there are state and local business processes, there are federal processes. And I would appreciate your thoughts on how we go about trying to do that so that we get what we need in a cost-efficient manner.
So the question is, what describe the processes at the federal level and at the state level? And
No, not describe, because I don't know that anybody can describe it. I'd like to hear their thoughts on how we might try to address it.
You may not, I know what Mike's feeling is about what I'm going to say, so it doesn't specifically address it, but in broader component parts. There is a law that was passed 9 years ago by the United States Congress, and passed and signed, called the Safety Act. The Safety Act is, because I always have to write it down to make sure, Support Anti-Terrorism by Fostering Effective Technologies Act. Administered through the Science and Technology Directorate, companies can go to them free of charge, in essence, and submit an application to be designated or hopefully certified as a Safety Act technology that when deployed, when implemented in the public sector, not just in the commercial sector, not just in the public sector, could in essence lessen one's liability. And as a result of that, you could, in essence, see a greater push out of technologies. And it shouldn't be just, in my mind, anti-terrorism. It should be, as we heard on the panel just before now, cybersecurity is not just a terrorist activity, it's beyond terrorism. And if you, in fact, have that, it should be used in other component parts of hacking, and et cetera. But the fact remains is that after 9 years, we have about 450 companies. That's it, that have gone through the designation and certification process. I think only 125 have gone through the higher level of certification. That is something that we in industry have a responsibility to do with the government to push forward so that whether it's Chris's technology or Tom's technology or anybody in this room, in essence, is incentivized to, in essence, deploy those things. And that could be at least one component part, Mike, of what you're at least raising, that there are laws on the books. There are ways in which the Science and Technology Directorate and other federal agencies and components can, in fact, utilize what's already there. The insurance industry hasn't been utilized successfully to, in essence, ask the right questions of companies with regard to their ability as their general liability, and in the underwriting, what have you done to raise the higher level of safety within your own company, security in your own company? If they knew what the algorithms were, every company, forget about government passing laws or states passing regulations, every company would have to answer a question successfully and hopefully get a better underwriting process. So there are things that are out there. We have not successfully communicated them.
Yeah, I would agree. That's one point. We cannot escape the fact that the resources, the majority of resources, at least financially, come from the federal government, and how they flow down to different areas is different. If you get 75 CEOs together that talk about what they could contribute in order to be effective to respond, that's fantastic. But at the end of the day, we have to find, and I'm speaking obviously from the federal perspective, we have to find a way for industry to better understand the needs somehow, not just at the point of releasing those needs. And as I said at the beginning, that really requires us to be able to swim farther upstream to have conversations with real decision makers and the people who are going to come up with those requirements going forward. And by the way, to say, hey, here's a couple of wild and crazy ideas that maybe you haven't thought about. And so when I was thinking about innovation for this panel, I thought about a number of different things and not product-based. And I'll give you an example. I know people in the audience, and when John was in government, he had a particular problem. We brought a solution to him. Now, John couldn't use the solution because it was politically infeasible, but it was a cool solution. That went back into the quiver with our arrows because perhaps there's something else that can be pulled from that. My colleague, Tim Collins, who's here from New Century, who spent an awful lot of time in the SAS doing counter-IRA activities, we got together and had a bunch of chats and said, How would we apply that to Mexican cartels? So when we talk about innovations, it spans the spectrum, and we really, and I hope I'm going to the question, it really spans hard, and it's hard to corral it, but we all have to find our niche, right? Federal level things, local community level things, really having the tough job of representing so many different constituencies under a certain organization, and then making cool stuff that flies. So I would really look for being able to maneuver within that whole space rather than always trying to corral things. I would rather have more arrows to draw from than necessarily cinching it up somewhere and saying, this is the primary bag that you should draw from, and the wild and crazy ideas, they'll come when we have a real crisis.
I would just only add to Chris, the fact is that when you're talking about limited resources, we have to get to the mission, and not just saying, I've made the greatest thing in the world
Agreed.
that you should buy. And the nature of a dialogue between government and industry, between local and federal, that goes to the issue of what we have, the capabilities that we bring, the resources that we bring, as well as all aspects of the investments that we're willing to make, have to be something that works for everybody. And corporations don't have the extra kind of cash that government doesn't have anymore either. We're all hamstrung, and therefore we're going to have to, as I said at the front end, we have to be smarter about how we do this. And one way of doing that is to open up a better dialogue so that we can eventually get to a true public-private partnership. But right now, it's vendors are over here and contractors are over here, and the perception is that all you're out for is for money, and that it's not about how we, the two of us, can work together on mission.
Okay, but on the real, a lot of these, it's like you can blame government for all this stuff, but come on.
No, it's not. It's our fault.
A lot of DHS programs, especially big acquisition programs, have gone down the tubes, right? And it can't be just contractor problems, right? When big border technology programs go south, big Coast Guard cutter programs go south. That's not just the government screwing that up. Right?
You're absolutely correct, and I would tell you that it goes to the point that I think everyone has made, that the dialogue has to be there and it has to be up front, because the thing that we do first is try to point a finger and blame before we try to figure out what actually happened.
It's not just the dialogue. The knowledge has to be shared. And again, not to pick on the feds, but they aren't great at sharing with local businesses, much less even local law enforcement. In Los Angeles, after the Madrid bombings, all the local police agencies, federal agencies, got together and wanted to apply for a $10 million grant so they could have a laboratory, so they could have all cell phones. So if there was a bombing, the bomb squads could then know where that phone came from because of all the different varieties of phones throughout the world. This came up at a meeting. One of our CEOs said, well, we don't need that. In El Segundo, the industry has a research laboratory for other reasons, but we have every cell phone technology, we'll give it to you for free. You can just tap into it. Well, without that sharing of information, there would have been grants all over the country trying to get this $10 million for cell phone technology. We must communicate. We must communicate at the local level, the state level, with the contractors, with the federal government. And it is a two-way street, but I would say the federal government needs to do the most work in communicating.
Okay, let's get another question from the audience. You, sir, in the orange.
Don Lauren with the Tory Group. To pull the thread on what you've been discussing with respect to dialogue and shared information and cooperation, and to further what Jack said with respect to critical infrastructure protection, the President released PDD 8 in April, which solicits a cooperative relationship of partnership between the private sector, the government sector, I will add the personal sector, individual citizens. the Secretary of Homeland Security is tasked with developing a strategic plan on how to affect this system of capabilities-based approach to solving our Homeland Security needs. So while this is happening, how is industry, either your respective individual companies or the associations you represent, concomitantly working to determine how the private sector will work with government to carry out the direction of PDD-8 in affecting our Homeland Security?
Someone want to take a whack at that?
I don't know if I can talk to PDD-8 directly or even, but I'll talk about how that concept works with the Department of Defense and why I think it's a good idea. Over time, and as we see budgets get tighter and tighter, industry will have less discretionary funds to spend on research and development, and will be looking more and more to make certain that the monies that they spend are aimed precisely at targets of real opportunity and not just good ideas that doesn't have someone on the other side pulling for it. The Department of Defense has a whole series of programs, CRADAs, ACTDs, JCTDs, that are truly partnerships in understanding mission needs and evaluating alternative technologies to assess their capability, even going as far as doing mission utility assessments on them. To the extent we can convert those types of programs and processes and bring them forward to other government agencies, right on. That's the right thing to do.
Now this is really a process, this relationship building. And it's not something that lends itself well to presidential decision directives. I mean, they provide a framework, but it's all about relationships. And it's all about understanding what every party brings to the table and what everybody else can use and get out of it. The relationship with DHS is one that has gotten so much better in the past 7 or 8 years. I can remember not long after DHS stood up, a meeting in which DHS officials were discussing sending teams out to brief corporate CEOs on how security should be conducted. These teams at the time were not the DHS people of today who've been carefully selected and so forth. Basically, it was what came right after 9/11, where the government reached out and grabbed former SEALs and Green Berets and all these people and was pulling in law enforcement people wherever they could find them. We had to tell DHS, CEOs are not going to sit down and talk with you. Okay, they have corporations to run. Their chief security officers will. They'll do it, however, as a courtesy, because they're on site, they're on the job, they know what they're doing. They've been where you are, and now they're responsible for security at this corporation. And third, there's not much you can teach them about security. You just don't have the knowledge to go into a pharmaceutical company, a transportation company, a bank, and tell them how to do security. So we've come from a time when DHS operated at that frighteningly rudimentary level to a time now when there's a much better understanding on DHS's part of what's out there in the private sector already on the job that they can use and coordinate with, and on the part of the private sector of what DHS and other federal agencies need and want. And basically what my members need and want from the federal government is not to be told how to do security. They want communication and coordination. They want to know what government is doing and what it means, and they want to see coordination of the type that closes the gaps that individual corporations can't address, the interdependencies, if you will, between industry sectors that individual industries and companies can't do anything about. So those are the two essential roles for DHS that we see: coordination, communication. But you can't tell my members, by and large, how to do security. They're there, they understand it, they know it, they constitute an asset. Today we're in a much better place than we were 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago.
Okay, we've got time for 2 more questions real quick. Anyone?
Hi, Val Oxford, also from the Tory Group, and a graduate of the DHS orphanage, as Denny Blair might have referred to it. Secretary Chertoff and I established a program to provide direct funding at the state and local level to build capacity and capability. Because we didn't feel the grant program was doing that in the way it was originally intended, We understand DHS is now considering dramatic cuts to the grant program. What does that do to the dialogue you're having here in terms of federal, state, and local cooperation, as well as the private and public cooperation?
And I'd add to that, what's the proposed cut to DHS S&T supposed to be, like 50%, 60%? So let's answer that, and let's do it quick because we only got a couple minutes left. Someone want to take that on?
I think that there's no question but that whatever cuts, whether it's the S&T budget, which is viewed upon, and a number of the folks that I've talked to on the Hill are talking about immediate results. And S&T has never been about the sprint. It's always been about the marathon. And I think that that's part of industry working together with government that looks at the value of what S&T brings. However, in the S&T component part is that the research and development that the Undersecretary, Tara O'Toole, has, is she's overseeing multiple S&Ts and R&D processes that are going on with other components over which she has no authority. So I think it was Chief Fisher and the others on that panel yesterday talked about that we needed greater harmonization that goes forward so that we can use our money better and not get into the duplicative as opposed to this multi-layered approach. We have to look at it in a much smarter way. The grant process is similarly. We've got to make sure that what we're looking at is mission, and Chief Fisher was talking about that as well in terms of harmonization and where we got to go. I think that as what CBP has done successfully, what Tara O'Toole is trying to do in terms of the work that she's doing, what I think the Undersecretary in Management is trying to put together, because there's 11 different procurement component parts that are going on at DHS, we're just trying to say, okay, let's talk about what our mission is, and then we can build to that mission and what your need is. And right now, we've been doing program after program after program. I've always used the analogy, Val, and I think this is an important one, that on 9/11, the concern was that the Port Authority policemen and the Port Authority firemen couldn't talk to one another. You know, and if they had only been on the same radio frequency, and it goes on. My attitude is that they had been on the same frequency, they just would have been talking to each other as they died. Because we've put too much emphasis over the last 15, 20 years in the IT arena on the T versus the I. Information, content, substance, that has got to be a greater emphasis of what we do. So we can't just rely on the widget or the product or the technology. We've got to rely on the fact that there's intellectual capital that it resides at the department, at the state and local level, and in industry. And Congress has to facilitate that. It's a triangulated kind of responsibility. So I don't want to speak to the specifics of a grant or specifics as to the S&T, but how are we going to now, in this, is what I call the new normal, approach Homeland Security and Homeland Defense in a better, effective, smarter, efficient way?
If you build on Marc's point and you talk about what do you do with finite resources and indeed reducing resources, again, I hate to harp on it. It's not always about the government saying this is my requirement, because one might ask, how did we arrive at that requirement? But one of the things that have been successful in the private sector to solving some really, really tough challenges or really cool challenges is the government particularly can spend some of its resources doing X Prize-like things, contests. Some people would say, well, we have it. It's called an RFP. It's not. We have really tough challenges. If we're going to have finite resources, let the smartest people in the room come up with stuff. Don't constrain them necessarily by, a 300-page document that comes out and says, section L&M, this is what we need. It's just the acquisition process. Let's have some X Prize stuff that really gets to the heart of some of our most difficult challenges. Spend the money on that, or at least reserve some money for that. You're going to see some amazing thing happen, and you're going to see the members of some of these organizations, my company, will fall in line and come after it and say, ooh, well, add that, and guess what, I can add to that. If we approach it like that, in some cases, we will have far greater results with the finite resources that we have.
Got time for one more? No, got time for 0 more questions. Okay, so why don't you put your hands together, thank the panel, it's great.
We're going to have a short break, everyone, and we'd ask everybody to get back at about 3:45 if possible.